everyone. For Module 12 Learning Outcome number 2, we're now going to be covering the spinal nerves. Therefore, with regards to the spinal nerves, there are actually 31 pairs, and these are going to be named for the level of the spinal cord at which each one will emerge from. So there are going to be 8 pairs of cervical nerves, and these are going to be designated C1 through C8. There are going to be 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, and these are going to be designated for T1 through T12. There are going to be 5 pairs of lumbar nerves that are going to be designated L1 through L5, and 5 pairs of sacral nerves that are designated S1 through S5. And at the end, we have 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Now pay attention to the number of nerves. Remember we had for the sacrum, it's made up of 5 fused vertebrae. Therefore, we have S1 through S5. For the lumbar vertebrae, remember we had 5. Therefore, the nerves are L1 through L5. Thoracic vertebrae, we had 12. Therefore, they're numbered T1 through T12. But remember that the cervical vertebrae, we only had 7. And here we have the cervical nerves that are numbered C1 through C8. So we have an extra nerve. And this is because the first nerve is going to be located between the atlas and the occipital bone. And the last cervical nerve is going to be located below the 7th cervical vertebrae. Therefore, we have one above the first vertebrae and one below the last cervical vertebrae that will be considered cervical nerves. Therefore, we have 8 cervical nerves, and all of these will total, like I said, 31 spinal nerves. Now, these spinal nerves, once they leave the spinal cord, they will extend outward from the vertebral column to be able to innervate the periphery. And the nerves in the periphery, they're not going to be straight continuations of the spinal nerves, but they're rather going to be reorganized. So they're going to come together and then they will branch out again. And these will give rise to specific nerves that are going to follow a different pathway. Now the axons from the different spinal nerves, they will come together into what we call a systemic nerve. And this occurs at 4 places along the length of the vertebral column. And each of these systemic nerves are going to be identified as nerve plexuses. Therefore, the word plexus is going to be used to describe this network of nerve fibers that are going to come together, but they will have no associated cell bodies. So it's just the axons of the neurons that are coming together and not the neuronal cell body. And there are 4 different plexuses. 2 are going to be branching off from the cervical level, and 1 will come from the lumbar level, and 1 will come from the sacral level. The 2 that come from the cervical level are going to be the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus. And the one that's coming from the lumbar level is going to be called the lumbar plexus, which makes sense. And the one that's coming from the sacral level is going to be called the sacral plexus. Let's start with the first one, which is the cervical plexus. It's going to be composed of axons from the spinal nerves that go from C1 through C5. And it's actually only part of C5 that forms the cervical plexus. And in this plexus, it will innervate several structures. We have it innervating areas of the head, neck, and chest. And these are going to be parts of the skin that it will innervate. It can innervate muscles, and these have to do with the larynx. But the main one that I really want you to know that will be important, that originates from the cervical plexus, is the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve, it's going to be important because it will provide sensory information to the diaphragm, which is a muscle. So it will receive that sensory input if the diaphragm needs to contract or if the diaphragm needs to relax to be able to help with respiration. So again, the phrenic nerve is the only nerve that I need you to know that originates from the cervical plexus. And out of the 8 cervical nerves that form the cervical plexus, the ones that will form the phrenic nerve are C3 through C5. Now, if we were to look at the lab model and try to identify the cervical plexus, we would be able to mainly look at this side over here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These will come together to form the cervical plexus. On this side, we're actually missing a nerve over here. So it's not that we don't have the nerve, it's that the model doesn't show the nerve. So we would have an extra one over here. So C1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These form the cervical plexus. And notice how you have a nerve that's coming down over here, and this nerve will be the nerve that will innervate the diaphragm, which is located between the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. Next, we have what we call the brachial plexus, which will also originate mainly from the cervical region. So part of C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1 will come together to form the brachial plexus. Now remember that we had part of C5 forming the cervical plexus. So the other part will form the brachial plexus, and then we have 4 more nerves, which are C6, 7, 8, and T1. Now these nerves, when they're close to the spinal cord, we call them roots. And these roots, they will come together at some point right over here at this region, and then they will branch out again, and they will form what we call trunks. The trunks will then come together and then branch out again and form what we call an anterior and a posterior division. And then these divisions will come together and form what we call the cords. And the cords will branch out and come together and form what we call the nerves or the branches. Therefore, let's see what happens. So C5 and C6 are going to come together to form what we call the superior trunk. C7 by itself will form the middle trunk, and C8 and T1 will come together to form what we call the inferior trunk. So if you have a superior trunk, you're going to have an inferior trunk. And then the one in the middle is called the middle trunk. And these will come together to form what we call 3 anterior divisions, which are these 3 over here, and then 3 posterior divisions. And these divisions will then come together to form the cords. We're going to have 3 main cords. One that's going to be the lateral cord. If we have a lateral, we have a medial. And then one that's going to be the posterior cord. And we don't have an anterior cord. And the reason why we don't have an anterior cord is because the lateral and the medial are actually located anteriorly. And therefore, the superior trunk, the middle trunk, and the inferior trunk will come together to form a posterior cord, which will be located posteriorly on our body. And then the lateral cord, which runs lateral on our body, so it will run laterally over here, will give rise to 2 branches or 2 nerves, which are the muscular cutaneous nerve and the median nerve. Now the median nerve will also be formed by the medial cord that comes together with the lateral cord, form the median nerve. Then we have the posterior cord, which will give rise to 2 branches or 2 nerves, which are the axillary nerve and the radial nerve. And then the medial cord will come together to give rise to the ulnar nerve by itself, but remember, it also came together with the lateral cord to form the median nerve. Now, a few things that you guys get confused with is with regards to the median nerve and the medial cord. But remember, if we have a lateral cord, we have a medial cord, so AL, AL. Therefore, the other one is what we call the median nerve. And here I have a little mnemonic for you to be able to use with regards to how the roots become the trunk, which then becomes these subdivisions which then becomes the cord, which then becomes the branches. So roots, trunks, divisions, cords, branches, or real Texans drink cold beer. Now on the next few slides, we're going to be talking specifically about these nerves or these terminal branches. Before we move on, let's see on the lab model how the spinal nerves are going to give rise to the brachial plexus. So remember we had C1, C2, 3, 4, and 5 giving rise to the cervical plexus. But part of 5 will give rise to the brachial plexus as well. So 5, 6, 7, 8, and T1 will be your roots that will give rise to the trunks. Therefore, C5 and C6 will come together to form the superior trunk. C7 gives rise to the middle trunk, and C8 and T1 give rise to the inferior trunk. And then they come together to give rise to the cords. So this one that's more lateral will be the lateral cord. This one that's more medial will be the medial cord. And the one in the middle will give rise to the posterior cord. Same thing on the other side. Remember, we're missing a nerve over here. So this will be C1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Part of 5 and 6 will give rise to the superior trunk. C7 gives rise to the middle trunk, and C8 and T1 will give rise to the inferior trunk. And here they come together to give rise to the cords. This is your lateral cord, your posterior cord, and your medial cord. And then they will come together to give rise to the terminal branches, which we will talk as we move along. Let's start first with the axillary nerve. Remember that the axillary nerve originates from the posterior cord. Therefore, it will run posteriorly behind the humerus and come out over here. You can see a little bit of it right over there. But again, this is a posterior view, so you can see how the axillary nerve will run behind the humerus and innervate, in this case, the deltoid and the teres minor. Do you need to understand all this? Not necessarily, you won't be accountable for this, but you just need to know that the axillary nerve originates from the posterior cord, and therefore it will be running behind the humerus. On this image, we can see again the axillary nerve, but we can see a little bit of it on this side as well, running behind the humerus. Now let's talk about the radial nerve, which is the other nerve that originates from the posterior cord. Because it originates from the posterior cord, it will run posteriorly, as we can see from this posterior view. Also on these models, we can see the radial nerve will be this nerve right over here that runs behind the humerus, and then it continues right over here. When it gets to the elbow, it actually splits into two. So there's a branch that runs with the thumb superficially, which is called the superficial radial nerve. And at the level of the elbow, it will actually go inside and come out on the posterior side. So this will be the deep radial nerve. So again, the superficial radial nerve will run superficially with the thumb. So at the level of the elbow, the radial nerve, which is this nerve over here, splits right over there. This is your superficial radial nerve with the thumb. And this little branch over here on the anatomical position will be your deep radial nerve that goes in here in the muscles, and then it comes out on the posterior side. On the pronated view, we can see that this would be your radial nerve right over here, and it will come out on this side. At the level of the elbow, it will split right over there. This part that's running with the thumb will be your superficial radial nerve, and this other branch over here that's now on the posterior side. See how it's on top of the radius? And this is a posterior view of your hand. So this would be your deep radial nerve. And we will be able to see better images of this nerve when we look at the limbs that have the muscles in the next few slides. We will be able to see this. So again, the radial nerve, before it branches, it's just called radial nerve. Once it gets to the elbow, right over there, it will split. Becomes the superficial and the deep radial nerve. Next, we have the musculocutaneous nerve, and as you guys can see, it will innervate the biceps brachii and the brachialis, which are both located on the humerus. So it's the only nerve, of course, besides the axillary nerve that runs around the humerus right over here at the neck, that will stay on the humerus. All the other nerves, they will come down to your hand. So the musculocutaneous nerve, it will originate from the lateral cord. And on the lab model, we can see that it will be this nerve right over here that ends on the humerus. So on this side, it will be this nerve right over there. Next, we have the ulnar nerve. Like the name says, it will run medially because it will run together with the ulnar bone. Therefore, one thing that I need you to notice is that this left hand over here is in an anatomical position. However, the right hand is pronated. Notice how the radius is on top of the ulna. So let's look at the left side of the model first because that's going to be easier for us to understand. Remember that the ulnar nerve originates from the medial cord, which makes sense because this is running medially, and as it comes down, it continues to your pinky. And therefore, as you can see over here, it will innervate the pinky side of your hand. Therefore, if we follow over here, this would be your medial cord, and it continues as your ulnar nerve that goes down to your pinky, as this would be your pinky right over there. On the pronated side, we have the ulnar nerve coming down over here, but now because you are pronated, you can see how it will continue over here because it's going towards the pinky. So don't forget to see where your pinky is, and therefore you will be able to follow the ulnar nerve. Another thing that you can do is just place your hand on the medial side and then pronate, and you will see how you can see that the ulnar nerve is actually running underneath the ulna and the radius, and it will come out on the pinky side. Another thing that's interesting about the ulnar nerve, I don't know if you guys have heard of the funny bone. So the funny bone is really not that funny. The funny bone is actually not a bone at all. It's actually the nerve, which is the ulnar nerve. And because the ulnar nerve is usually very protected by muscles, once it gets to the elbow, it's not that protected, and it runs right next to the medial epicondyle. So when you hit and you bump your very bony elbow, it hits the ulnar nerve, and that's what causes a lot of pain. Therefore, the funny bone is actually, again, your ulnar nerve that's passing through the elbow. Next, we have the median nerve, and the median nerve will also, like the ulnar nerve, originate from the medial cord together with the lateral cord. So both of them will give rise to the median nerve. And the median nerve will run right in the middle. And you can see how it will be able to innervate several of your fingers. So basically, it will complement the ulnar nerve, because remember, the ulnar nerve is what's innervating the pinky and a little bit of your ring finger. On the lab model, let's look first at the side that's in anatomical position. And because it's the median nerve, it will run down in the middle. So this will be your median nerve going all the way down to your fingers. On the pronated side, we can see the median nerve coming right over here. And because it's pronated, then you can't see how it's running behind the ulna and the radius. So it stops right over there at the level of the elbow on the pronated side. Here we can see the upper limb lab models that had the muscles that we talked about. This is an anterior view. We can see the axillary nerve going in here, and it will come out on the other side, which can be seen on this lateral view right over there. So this yellow structure over here is your axillary nerve that's wrapping up the humerus. The other nerve that runs posterior is going to be the radial nerve, remember? So the radial nerve, we can't really see a lot of the radial nerve over here because it's running posterior, but it comes out over here at the level of the elbow. So this is still your radial nerve. Once it splits right over there, running with the thumb, is going to be your superficial radial nerve. And this part over here that goes in here and it comes out on the posterior side will be your deep radial nerve. Then anteriorly, we can see the median nerve that will come down in the middle. And if we remove these muscles, we can see it coming down over here. So this would be your median nerve. And the ulnar nerve is the one that runs with the pinky, so more medial. This is your ulnar nerve. You can see a little bit of it over here, and it continues with the pinky. And notice how these two are anterior views. So if it's anterior, you see the ulnar nerve with the pinky. If it's posterior view, this is your deep radial nerve. It's not your ulnar nerve, it's the deep radial nerve that entered anteriorly and came out on the other side. Deep radial nerve. And the nerve that stays on the humerus on top of the brachialis is your musculocutaneous. And the musculocutaneous, you can see a little bit of it over here. This is your biceps brachii. This is your coracobrachialis, which we didn't cover. But if it stays on the humerus and ends right over there, is the musculocutaneous. Notice how the ulnar goes to the pinky, the median comes down to your other fingers, and the radial nerve also goes to your fingers. So the only one that stays at the humerus, of course, together with the axillary, will be your musculocutaneous nerve. Now, the lumbar and the sacral plexuses, they sometimes are collectively referred to as the lumbosacral plexus, just because both of them will arise from the end of the spinal cord, and they will supply the nerves for the pelvis and the lower limbs. So sometimes they're referred collectively again as the lumbosacral plexus. But these will give rise to important nerves, which are the femoral nerve, the saphenous nerve, the sciatic nerve, tibial nerve, common fibular nerve, which we will cover in the next few slides. But notice how they are originating over here in the lumbar region in this case, and these are originating in the sacral region. Let's start with the obturator nerve, like the name says. Obturator means that it will pass through the obturator foramen. Remember, we had an obturator foramen in the coxal bone. Therefore, this nerve that's coming down over here and going through the obturator foramen is what we call the obturator nerve. And we can see on this image where it ends right over there. So this is your obturator nerve. And because it innervates a lot of the adductors, it will be located medially. Next, we have the femoral nerve, like the name says. Femoral means that it will stay on the femur, so it won't go all the way down to your leg. It stays on the thigh. And you can see right over here, this will be your femoral nerve. It does branch out into other smaller nerves, but it stays on the femur. So here on this image, we can see, notice how this foot is off to the side. So we can see just a little bit of the femoral over here, but on this image, we can see that it ends right over there. So that would be your femoral nerve. And because it innervates several of the vastus, it makes sense, right? That's located anteriorly on the thigh. Next, we have what we call the sciatic nerve, which is this huge nerve over here that will come from the merge of several different nerves that come not only from the lumbar region, but the sacral region, and it will give rise to this huge nerve that's called the sciatic nerve. So it's not the tibial nerve like this image says. This is the sciatic nerve. Now the sciatic nerve, once it gets over here to the level of the knee, it will split into two different nerves. One of them is your tibial nerve. So the tibial nerve comes down over here posteriorly, and it will innervate, as we can see, the posterior side of the foot. Then the other branch of the sciatic nerve is what we call the common fibular nerve. So we will see the tibial and the common fibular nerve on the next two slides. But this main nerve over here that originates not only from the lumbar plexus but also from the sacral plexus, and it passes, remember we had the greater sciatic notch and the lesser sciatic notch on the coxal bone. That's where this nerve will pass through. And again, once it reaches the knee, it splits into two. And the two are the next two slides that we will see. But on the lab image, this huge one is your sciatic nerve. Like we see over here, it runs posterior. So on this anatomical position, we cannot see it running behind the femur and the tibia. But on this image where the foot is to the side, we can see the sciatic nerve running posteriorly. So now it's the tibial nerve. Like I said, it will branch from the sciatic nerve at the level of the knee, and we can see again where it will innervate. And since this is your sciatic nerve, this will be your tibial nerve that runs posterior. See how the tibial nerve runs posterior? This is your tibial nerve right over there. Therefore, on the foot to the left of the image, we can't see the tibial nerve because it's running behind the tibia, posteriorly to the tibia. So therefore, we can only see the tibial nerve on this model on this right side of the image, which is really the left lower limb of the model. Then from the sciatic nerve, we have the other nerve, which is what we call the common fibular nerve. So the common fibular nerve is not this nerve over here. It's going to be a nerve that will originate from the split of the sciatic nerve that runs behind the knee that we saw already. And it swings to the side because it's a fibular nerve, so it will swing laterally. And once it swings laterally, it gives rise to two nerves. There's going to be a superficial fibular nerve and a deep fibular nerve. Now pay attention to this. The superficial fibular nerve will stay on the lateral side of the foot, but the deep fibular nerve will come on top of the tibia, but it's still called the deep fibular nerve. So even though it's going to be on top of the tibia, it's still called the deep fibular nerve because it's branching from the common fibular nerve. So on the model, we have the sciatic. See how it splits right over there? So this would be your common fibular nerve that's swinging laterally and coming out over here. Because this one right over here is on top of the tibia, this is going to be your deep fibular nerve. Can we see the superficial fibular nerve? No, because the superficial fibular nerve is on the fibula. So on the left side of the image, which is the right side of the model, we can see the common fibular nerve coming right over there, which is lateral. This nerve that's coming on top of the tibia would be your deep fibular nerve. And I know it's hard to see, but on top of the fibula over here is going to be your superficial fibular nerve. And this nerve over here, you don't need to know, which is the sural nerve, and this is your great saphenous nerve, which you also don't need to know. On these muscle models, we can see those nerves as well. Anteriorly, we're going to have the femoral nerve here in yellow, which will stay on the femur. So this is your femoral nerve. Posteriorly, we have the sciatic nerve that will split at the level of the knee. The part that goes laterally is going to be the common fibular nerve, and the part that continues posteriorly all the way down will be your tibial nerve. So sciatic nerve, see where it splits right over there? Tibial nerve, common fibular nerve swings to the front laterally and gives rise to two nerves. The one that stays on the tibia is the deep fibular nerve. The one that comes to the fibula is the superficial fibular nerve. So deep fibular nerve on the tibia, superficial fibular nerve on the fibula. And again, sciatic, tibial nerve, common fibular nerve. Now this image I think is very important for us to understand that these nerves that we're talking about, they will contain both sensory and motor input. How is that possible? Well, look at this model over here. We're going to have, this will be the posterior side or the dorsal side, and this is the anterior side. How do I know this? Well, we have this structure over here, which we talked about already, which is the dorsal root ganglion. And notice how there's a tiny little purple structure over there, which represents the cell body of this sensory neuron that's arriving from the sensory input, so the receptor side. The cell body stays here in the dorsal root ganglion, and then it comes to the spinal cord, where it will synapse with another neuron, which is called the interneuron, that will then sometimes synapse with another neuron and then exit the spinal cord as a motor information. So once they exit, they have motor information going out. So you're going to have sensory information coming in, motor information coming out, and this whole structure over here represents a spinal nerve. So that's why we can say that the spinal nerves will contain both motor and sensory information. Now, another thing that I want you to notice is the morphology of these neurons. So notice how this neuron over here that has the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion has a very long dendrite, a cell body, and then a long axon with terminal button. So this morphology is the morphology of this neuron that we talked about. Therefore, the cell body is located outside of the central nervous system, so outside of the spinal cord. Therefore, is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it's the unipolar or pseudo-unipolar type of neuron. And this other neuron over here is what we call the multipolar neuron. Notice how the cell body and the dendrites are close together. So this is what it's representing. And then it has an axon with the terminal button that will synapse with another neuron that has the cell body and the dendrites close together. So again, a multipolar neuron with then a long axon, which is what we see over here. So what will differentiate if it's unipolar or a pseudo-unipolar from a multipolar is the fact that the cell body of this one is located very far from the dendrites, which will be at the receptor. And this one over here, which is a multipolar, the cell body and the dendrites are located very close to each other. And the last type of neuron that you need to know is the bipolar, which is located more in special senses. So we will start covering this on the next module. And on this image, we've seen this already previously, but this is the sensory input. For example, a pain that you're receiving from this nail on your finger. It sends the information down this afferent fiber with the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. It synapses with an interneuron, which will synapse with another motor neuron and send the input for the muscle to contract and remove your hand from what's causing this injury. This slide is showing you the anatomy of the peripheral nerve, which has the same concept as we saw, for example, for the muscle fibers. So remember, we had a myofibril that was wrapped up by a membrane that was called an endomysium that formed a muscle fiber, and then several muscle fibers will come together and be wrapped up by a perimysium that would form a muscle fascicle, and then several muscle fascicles will be wrapped up by the most superficial membrane, which was the epimysium, to form the skeletal muscle. Here is the same thing. You're going to have these membranes that will wrap up an axon. Each axon will be wrapped up by what we call the endoneurium. Then several axons, when they come together, they're wrapped up by the perineurium. And this will form what we call a fascicle. And then several fascicles will be wrapped up by the last, most superficial layer, which is the epineurium. And all of these together will form what we call the spinal nerve, which will contain axons that are going to be sensory and motor. Therefore, both type of information will be passing through this spinal nerve. Here we have an image of the peripheral nerves that are mapped out in this layout that's called a dermatome. So a dermatome is going to be defined as these areas of the skin on your body that will be able to rely on specific nerve connections on your spine or your spinal cord. So in this way, the dermatomes, they're much like a map. So you can see from this image that they have mapped out which nerve will be innervating which part of your skin. And this is important because you're able to verify which nerve is damaged by knowing where in the skin these nerves will be innervating. So for example, if you have pain in this area right over here, you know that this is innervated by L1. Therefore, you know that the nerve is being damaged in this location.